The morning came with a thin light and the metallic smell of rain still sitting on the rails. Daniel Hayes stood on the pedestrian bridge that crossed the line at the edge of Millwood. He liked the way the air felt there, how the steel carried sound, how he could tell the difference between a good day and a bad one by the tone of the whistle that came through the valley. He wrapped his fingers around the cold railing and listened. The bridge was quiet, except for the murmur of traffic far away and the first vibration in the rails below. The 7:15 freight was on time. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the curve where the train would appear, one bright headlight sliding along the track like a coin. He whispered to no one, the way he always did, that the train was happy today. The pitch was right. Happy meant ordinary. Happy meant safe. He breathed out and counted the seconds between the vibrations, content with the order of things. Then another sound broke through the pattern, wrong and sharp. It was the whine of a motorcycle engine pushed too hard on wet pavement. It came closer, wobbling, coughing, trying to fight for grip. Daniel's eyes followed the noise toward the service road that ran beside the tracks. A black shape shot into view, sideways, spinning. The rider had lost control. The motorcycle hit the chain-link fence, burst through it, and slid down the muddy slope straight toward the rails. When it stopped, the bike lay across the track, and the man lay half on top of it, twisted and still. The freight whistle answered from the curve, a long warning cry. His mother's voice lived somewhere in the back of his head. Stay away from the train. The train is strong. The train does not stop for you. But this time the train was not what needed avoiding. This time the train was where the danger was. Someone needed help. He could help. Therefore, he would. He turned from the railing and ran. The stairs of the bridge clanged under his shoes. Gravel shifted and spat up behind him. He slid down the embankment, mud grabbing at his sneakers, cold water splashing up his jeans. The whistle came again, louder. The rails were singing now. He reached the man. The biker was huge, wrapped in a black leather jacket patched with faded symbols. One leg was pinned under the motorcycle's frame. His face was pale beneath streaks of oil and rain. He tried to move and failed. His voice came out broken. He said the bike had his leg, and that he could not move it. Daniel's eyes measured the situation. The way he measured everything. Lifting was impossible. Pushing was possible. He planted his feet in the mud and found the right angle. He pressed his shoulder against the frame, used the slick slope for leverage, and pushed. The machine shifted an inch, then another. The man groaned, pulled his leg free, and rolled toward the ditch. Daniel grabbed the leather at his shoulder and dragged with him, both of them crawling through the gravel. The ballast stones bit into his hands, but he counted the distance in his head. 3 feet. 5. 8. Far enough? The horn of the train tore through the air. He felt the heat and wind before the first car reached them. The engine roared past, a moving wall of metal and force that turned the stranded motorcycle into a shower of shrapnel. Bits of chrome and black plastic whirled above them. The ground shook like it was angry. Daniel pressed himself flat, and the biker curled over him, shielding him from the sparks and debris. The air filled with the sharp taste of burned brake and hot oil. For a moment there was nothing but sound. Then the freight was gone, sliding away down the valley, leaving the smell of iron behind. They lay still. The man's breath came in rough bursts. Then he laughed once, a weak sound full of disbelief. He said Daniel had saved his life. Daniel looked at the twisted metal on the track and said the train would have hurt him. It was not heroism. It was fact. Sirens started somewhere beyond the trees, rising and falling. Radios crackled. Voices called codes Daniel did not know. Orange vests appeared on the slope, then dark uniforms. Then the wide brim of a hat. Someone shouted, 2 down, and another voice answered with numbers and letters. Boots slid in the mud. Hands reached for the biker first, checking his leg, calling for a board. A woman in a medic's jacket knelt in front of Daniel and asked if he was hurt. He said no, only wet. She smiled in a way that tried to make sense of him and said he did good work. He watched her gloves shine with rain and oil and thought about how everything left prints. The biker tried to lift his head to look at Daniel while they strapped his leg. He reached out once and caught Daniel's sleeve. He said thank you again, quieter this time. His eyes were the color of old asphalt. Daniel nodded but did not speak. Words were not necessary. The math had already been done. His mother's voice cut through the noise before she appeared. Then she was there, sliding down the last few feet of slope, slipping on mud, catching him in her arms. Her coat pressed against his wet shirt. Her heart hammered against his temple. She said, "He could have been killed." And her voice trembled on the edges of the words. He said the man needed help, and that trains could not stop fast. It was explanation and truth in one breath. She held him tighter and said she just needed him safe. The engineer came walking back along the track from the stopped train. His face was gray under his cap. He nodded to the medics, to the police, to Daniel, then went on to do whatever paperwork trains required when mornings went wrong. People moved around them with the practiced precision of procedure, measuring, photographing, speaking into radios. Someone marked the ground with chalk. Someone else rolled tape. Daniel noticed every sound, the soft squeal of the camera lens, the stamp of a boot, the click of a pen. They were keeping track of what happened, turning the chaos into data. When they lifted the biker onto a stretcher, his jacket shifted. A leather patch caught the light, an emblem of wings and wheels, letters he did not recognize. Daniel stared at it and thought it looked like something that belonged to a group, a brotherhood. He wondered what kind of people wore the same patch, what they would think when they heard the story. They carried the man to the waiting ambulance. Someone asked for his name. Daniel did not need to hear it. The event was already whole in his memory without names. The doors closed. The siren began again and pulled the ambulance away toward the road. Rain started falling in a thin drizzle. The train sat motionless, waiting for clearance. A steel animal caught in pause. Officers walked the length of it, talking into radios. Daniel stood beside his mother at the edge of the track. He could see the place where the bike had struck the rail. The metal there was scarred, a dark smear across the silver line. He looked at his hands. Mud and oil striped them like proof of something finished. One of the officers approached, asked his name and age, and wrote it down. 12, Daniel said. The officer thanked him for his quick thinking and said the town should be proud. Daniel nodded but watched the man's pen instead. How it made letters, how it left marks that could not be erased without effort. Proof mattered. People believed what was written down. When the last photograph was taken, his mother said, it was time to go home. They climbed the slope together. At the top, the town stretched quiet under the lifting fog. Daniel turned once more to look at the tracks. The rails ran straight and clean out of sight, carrying the echo of the train that had already gone. He raised his wrist and checked his watch. The second hand moved with steady certainty. Somewhere far down the line a new horn sounded, faint and regular, right on time. The shower ran until the water climbed from creek cold to the kind of warmth that lets breath loosen. Mud peeled from the hems of Daniel's jeans in slow brown threads, where his mother had dropped them into the tub. Oil freckles speckled his knuckles like a dark constellation. He worked the nail brush until gray crescents surrendered to pink skin, and the brake dust smell thinned beneath soap. Dinner happened in gentle steps, the way a house resumes its heartbeat after a scare. His mother set a folded towel on his chair, so the damp would not sink into the wood. His father warmed soup. Neither of them wanted much, but both of them ate, because eating argued quietly for ordinary, Emma watched him over the rim of her glass, holding her questions the way she had learned to when he needed silence to sort the day into its proper boxes. "What does a happy train feel like?" she asked finally, in a voice small enough not to frighten the answer. "Like the whistle sits in the middle and does not wobble," he said. "Like the rails speak before the horn." Their father's hand, the same hand that had taught him minutes and hours by finger and face, rested near his bowl without touching. The nearness warmed the air. His mother's phone vibrated twice where she had flipped it face down beside the sink. The school had called earlier, and then again, asking whether he was safe. The police would call for statements, people would not. Daniel felt the day expanding into other lives like ink in water. After dishes, after Emma zipped homework into her backpack, and his mother set the washer to a late cycle, he went to his room. The window faced the street and kept a faint fog map where his breath had touched it. He took his watch from the dresser and eased a toothpick along the bevel to lift out the last thin ribbons of grit, then polished the glass with a tissue until its face was itself again. The second hand ticked with its usual confidence. Routine is a ladder. He liked ladders. On the desk waited his train notebook. Ruled pages he had gridded with blue pen into columns labeled in his steady hand. Time, weather, whistle pitch, speed guess, oddities. He wrote that the early morning freight had been happy despite wet rails, that the emergency horn had stretched long at the curve, that the train slowed after the impact. He wrote that the distance from the rail to the leaves where they lay felt like 8 feet, and underlined the word 8 once. He left a space beneath for the things he did not yet know, like the name for a smell he had met but had not learned to call. The house offered its own small orchestra. Pipes ticked and settled. The dryer began a low, patient thrum. Emma brushed her teeth too hard, and the bristles squealed on enamel. Down the hall, a quiet conversation. His mother's cadence rose and fell. His father answered in shorter pieces, the way he did when worry wanted to manage the room, and he would not quite let it. They used words like aftershock and monitor, and he is 12. They also used his name like an anchor, each time pulling the day toward a safe, known shore. He lay back and looked at the ceiling. Hairline cracks made river maps, branching and finding each other again. The morning replayed, not like a movie with edits, not like a speech with lines, but as precise fragments that knew their order. Metal sliding, oil light, moule under nails, shoulder to frame. The biker's jacket heavy and wet, a field of patches bright and then gone. Brake screams trying to turn momentum into heat and failing to do it instantly. The way the world made a loud decision and then allowed him to keep living inside it. He must have drifted, because when he opened his eyes, the room had darkened and the house had tucked its sounds in close. The dryer was silent. The refrigerator clicked and relaxed. Outside, a car murmured past with a low rubber hush. His watch hand had walked a slice. He had not watched it walk. He rolled to his side and looked at the streetlight's pale cone. Mist swam through it like snow that had changed its mind and remained water. Somewhere else in town, a phone rang, and another phone took that ring, and 2 voices spoke with the elasticity people use when a day has stretched them past what they believed they could hold. Daniel did not know them, and did not hear the words, and did not need to. Sleep carried him under and back like a small current. Millbrook did not know it yet, but more than 1,000 motorcycles were already turning toward the valley. Their routes and idle manners settled for a morning not far away. He woke to his mother sitting on the edge of the bed, with a blanket across her knees, as if the night had found her there and decided to keep her. Her hand floated above his watch, tracing a slow circle over the glass, the way people remind time of its responsibilities. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He said, "We are going to the clinic this morning." She said, "Just so someone official can say you are all right." "I am all right," he said. "I know," she said, and a small smile pressed at the corner of her mouth without quite arriving. "But paper helps other people believe what I already do. Paper is proof. Proof is what people agree on when memory argues." He understood. He reached for his hoodie where it hung over the chair. It smelled like dryer sheet and clean cotton. The mud was gone. He liked that. They drove with the heater high, and the windows cracked because his mother liked fresh air even when it was cold. The town on a weekday morning was a sleepy animal. The coffee shop windows were orange. Steam made gentle weather inside cups. People who had seen sirens yesterday lifted 2 fingers off their steering wheels, little flags of concern and curiosity. Daniel watched streets. He had always known through a new transparent layer that would never quite lift. A place keeps what happens to it. At the clinic, a nurse took his temperature and set a number in the good part of the range. She peered into ears which were simply ears, present and unremarkable. She counted his pulse at his wrist and spoke the words steady like she enjoyed writing it. The doctor came in with the practiced calm of someone who has learned that voice can heal what medicine cannot reach. She moved a finger side to side and asked him to follow it with his eyes. She asked about dizziness. He shook his head. "Any headaches?" She asked. "Only the loud kind yesterday," he said, "the kind that comes from train brakes." His mother's laugh escaped and corrected itself into something frank and wet. The doctor smiled and called the description specific, said that specificity is the friend of medicine. Then she wrote a note for the school that said "cleared to return" and turned the paper for him to see the signature. Pen on paper again, ink making marks that turn a body into a fact in a file into a thing that will be believed later by a person who was never in the room. Chain of custody in a gentler field. They stopped for milk and bread and for the small chocolate donuts Emma asked for on mornings that grew larger than she was. Near the service desk, 2 men stood in leather. Their jackets were newer and their patches brighter. Not the same shapes as yesterday, but cousins. They spoke with their heads close. One looked up and met Daniel's eyes for a beat, not a challenge, and not exactly a smile. A recognition that did not require introduction. Then he lowered his gaze. Not every jacket holds the same story. His mother had told him once about uniforms and what people believe they know. He kept walking. At school, the hallway sent sound back the way a creek throws back light. His homeroom teacher paused an extra heartbeat when he stepped in, and 2 kids shifted backpacks from the best seats without being asked, as if space itself remembered gratitude. Tommy Jenkins did not speak, which was new, and sometimes new is the correct answer. Daniel opened his notebook and lined up his pencils by length. He greeted the class fish under his breath. The fish made its patient rectangle with holy devotion to routine, watching it smooth the noise in his head. The principal appeared in the doorway, the way men do when their job has taught them how to fill the frame. He asked politely if he could borrow Daniel and looked at the teacher in a way that was not a question. In the office, a woman with a small microphone clipped to her collar sat with her knees together and a notebook balanced on top. She said she was from the local station and wanted to ask a few questions. His mother was already there. She met his eyes with a look that said, "We will do this, and we will do it our way." "Can you tell me what you were thinking when you saw the man on the tracks?" the woman asked in a tone that tried to sound like a neighbor across a fence. "The train is strong," he said. "Trains cannot stop fast." He could not move, so I moved him. "Were you scared?" she asked. "A little," he said. Being scared does not mean you do not help. She wrote the words down the way the doctor had. Daniel watched the ink lay itself on the page. The station would send a link later. A link is another kind of receipt. People share receipts the way they share bread. She asked whether he knew the man's name. He said not yet, and that he did not need the name to know what had happened. His mother nodded as if he had answered an exam, whose question was dignity. By the time the last bell sent shoes slapping the corridor, the air had leaned from morning toward afternoon, without anyone being able to say the moment of the tilt. He rode home, watched the town he knew pass under November light, listened for the sound of something new, reaching for them. His mother's phone rang as they turned onto Maple. She pressed the button on the wheel and said her own name. A voice filled the car, not a performance voice, but the kind that belongs to people who make decisions and have learned how to ask permission. The voice thanked his mother for what her son had done, not in the polished way of statements, but like a person who had rehearsed the right kind of gratitude in private all day. The voice used words like respect and no disruption, and with your consent. His mother's hand tightened on the steering wheel exactly once. She asked careful questions that were more about intention than number. The voice answered careful answers. They agreed to speak again in the evening. The call ended with her name spoken correctly and slowly. Names are small forms of respect. At home, his father sat at the kitchen table with a map spread open and a pencil standing in a coffee cup like a tired flag. He said he was practicing cartography because the town might need it. His mother set her keys in the bowl by the door, the bowl that rang like a bell each time life came back inside. She leaned her shoulders into the counter and closed her eyes for 2 breaths, then opened them and set the room in motion again. They ate the donuts before dinner because sometimes order can be bent if you bend it on purpose. Emma asked if the man would come back to say thank you. Daniel said he did not know, and did not add that he had heard in the voice on the speakers the shape of a plan. He did not say that movement has a sound, and he could already hear a far engine in it. He drew an oval on a napkin that looked like the end of a locomotive, and put a dot in the middle for the light. Night placed its palms against the windows early, the way November likes to do. Lamps made islands of warmth across the rooms. The phone rang again. His mother answered again. She said, "We will think about it, and he needs quiet. And we are not a show, and respect looks like asking, not assuming." The voice agreed. And agreement laid a narrow bridge between shores that did not look alike. After the call, his father took a landing breath and said they would decide in the morning. Sleep would steady the scale. Daniel went to his desk and wrote 3 new lines in his notebook. The exact time of the call in words, the way his mother's hand flexed on the wheel, and the way the voice had said, "with your permission," as if permission were something sacred instead of something to be extracted. He turned out the light and lay down. Rain softened from mist into a fine, persistent veil, the kind that wets everything without announcing itself. Far off, a horn sounded, soft and correct, the middle pitch he loved. The clock in his head clicked once, sure of itself. On time, he thought, on time. Morning arrived like a measured breath, steady and cool, carrying the wet leaf smell that lives along the rails after rain. Daniel woke to the small sounds of a house already awake. A kettle tapped against its base. Paper slid under a hand. A phone settled on wood instead of being dropped. The sounds felt organized, like someone had stacked them in the right order while he slept. He dressed and followed the coffee smell to the kitchen. His mother had laid out ordinary things, and one thing that was not ordinary, beside the bread and the jar of jam, lay a stack of papers held by a black clip. The top sheet was an email, printed with its whole skin, showing not just the message, but the header lines that are the bones of truth. From 2. Copy. Date. Time. Subject. He liked headers because they told where a thing had been and when it moved. His mother tilted the paper so the light fell without glare. She did not read. She let him read at his pace. The subject said, Route and Idle Protocol. The time said sent at 7:12 in the morning. The from line carried the name Thomas Chun. The to line carried the name of Chief Peterson and the address of a town inbox that keeps copies even when personal phones forget. The carbon copy line carried the name of the church pastor and a second city account. At the bottom, a signature block listed a title and a street somewhere beyond the valley. The letters sounded like discipline. His father had opened the folding map and shaded a rectangle with pencil. He tapped the map with the tip in a soft drum as if to press the email through the paper and into the town itself. Staging here, he said almost to himself. Enter from the ridge, exit to the highway. No idling on residential streets, officers at each cross street. His voice had the calm of a person setting pins before the first ball rolls. We have conditions, his mother said. She spoke as if closing a door carefully so it would latch. She did not list them yet. She poured Daniel juice. The act felt like the first condition in disguise. Keep the child steady. The phone rang. No one looked startled. She set it to speaker and placed it between the map and the printed email. The same voice from the day before filled the kitchen. It was careful and clear. The voice of someone who understands what the words "with your permission" mean. The voice thanked them again. The voice used respect, without decoration. It said no disruption and traffic control and arrival window and departure window like blocks that could be stacked. It did not lean on numbers. It said before school begins and after the work rush, and we will not interfere. Then the ask came again, stated as a request, not a claim. Would the family allow a gathering, if the boy wished it, under their rules? Daniel watched his mother weigh each part before answering. There will be no alcohol, she said. There will be no engine revving for noise. There will be no speech that turns my son into a prop. No cameras in our home. You will coordinate with the chief and accept the route he sets. We will meet in a place where we can leave without press following. My son will be able to step away at any time, and no one will trail him. If any of that fails, it ends immediately. Yes, the voice said, each time, not as a sell but as an agreement. Yes to all. We will move at your pace. We will be guests. We will come to honor, not to perform. Daniel watched the second hand on his wrist move as his mother moved through her list. The hand did not rush, did not hesitate. It did what it promised. The voice seemed to promise as well. The sound of those promises laid across his shoulders like a vest made out of order. When the call ended, his mother did not look triumphant. She looked like a person who had shifted a heavy thing into a safe corner and kept a hand on it in case it wanted to move again. She signed the margin of the printed email and wrote "received" with the full date in words. She used ink. Ink can be a spine. They drove to the station house on the hill, the one with the flag that climbed, and then rested against the pole because there was not enough wind to make decisions. The lobby smelled like coffee that had stayed on the burner too long. The chief met them with his hat under his arm and a map already unrolled on a conference table dimpled by old staples. He shook Daniel's father's hand and nodded to his mother with the measured respect of someone who has seen hard work before breakfast. He crouched a little so his eyes met Daniel's, and he said it was an honor, not in the loud way of ceremony but in the quiet way that fits a small room. He traced the route with a capped pen, drawing circles without touching the paper. We bring them in along the ridge road, he said. 2 patrol cars lead. 1 runs the tail. A unit holds each cross street so nobody gets trapped and nobody cuts through. Church lot for staging. Reverend Wilson has offered it. She is sensible and firm. He looked to Daniel to see if sensible landed. Daniel nodded because he liked sensible. No revving, his mother said again. No revving, the chief said, and he wrote the words in the corner as if it were a contract. No burnouts, no stunts, engines at low idle or cut as directed. He added officer names along the margins, a ladder of responsibilities you could climb if something went wrong. He asked Daniel about crowds and where a quiet place should be if the sound stacked too high. Daniel said he could manage with rules and a map in his head. He said he liked to stand where he could see the next move. The chief nodded and drew a small square on the church plan. That is yours, he said. We will keep it clear. If anyone crosses that line, they meet me. They took a copy of the route and a copy of the email with the header at the top like a stamp. At home, his mother slid both into a clear sleeve and pressed the binder rings closed with a click that felt more important than its size. Chain of custody in a house can live in a binder. She printed a simple label for the spine and wrote it in block letters so no one could pretend not to see. School gave Daniel a shorter day under the doctor's note, and the principal honored it with a small bow of his head that looked like humility freshly learned. In the resource room, the counselor talked about how crowds can feel like weather and placed a small case in his palm with soft earplugs inside the color of a traffic cone. The case shut with a clean snap. She said, "These are tools, not crutches, and using tools is a kind of strength." He liked that sentence and stored it beside the whistle pitches in his mind. At lunch, Tommy set his tray across from Daniel's and said the soup was too salty. They ate the same soup and talked about nothing important, which was the gift. The ordinary can hold the whole day steady if you let it. After school, he found his mother at the dining table again, with the pastor on a speaker call, and the chief patched in. The pastor's voice had the warm grain of a person who can hold grief and laughter at the same time. She said the lot would be ready. The hall would have water and coffee. The bathrooms would be open and clean. Volunteers would hold doors and point toward exits rather than toward cameras. She would set folding chairs, but not too many, so standing would look like intention, not overflow. She said she would pray if asked, and keep silence if asked. The chief said the traffic notice had been posted with streets and times spelled out, and that the borough would place temporary signs where someone always thinks rules are for others. The fire department would lend cones, and 2 volunteers who know how to move big trucks quietly. A text chimed. Then, an email arrived. His mother opened it and printed the attachment. She set the fresh copy beside the morning's proof. Daniel read the header again because he likes to watch for details. He missed the first time. Sent at 7:12 in the morning. From Thomas Chun to Chief Peterson. Subject route and idle protocol. The body listed a schedule without leaning on hour marks. Arrival window. Engine discipline. Hand signals instead of shouted orders. A line that said, "We will do this at your pace and under your direction." At the bottom, a name that was printed and signed. The digital trail showed where it had traveled. His mother wrote initialed by Sarah Hayes and the full date beneath, and waited for the ink to go from wet shine to dry dull, then slipped the page behind the first one in the same sleeve. Late afternoon brought a knock and the chief again, this time with a clipboard and a laminated map. He put it on the table and clicked a dry erase marker from its notch. He drew green arrows for motion, blue arrows for exit lanes, and little red squares where officers would stand. "This goes with you tomorrow," he said to Daniel. "If at any moment you want to leave, you draw a line from where you are to the edge, and we will follow that line." He said this as if the town itself had made the promise. "What about media?" his mother asked. "They will have a penned area at the edge of the lot," he said, not quite smiling at the word penned. "They will stay in it. If they step out, we escort them out." He tapped one of the red squares. "We also have volunteers with signs that say, 'Do not film the child.' Some people need simple directions presented simply. We can do simple." When he left, the house exhaled. Daniel held the laminated map. The plastic felt cool and slick, like the underside of a leaf after rain. He studied the arrows and the colors and the small square that was his. He traced the engine path with one finger without touching. In his mind, he set the motors to a low idle, the kind of sound that is almost a purr. If a purr were made of metal and heat and care, his mother warmed pasta and set plates with a rhythm that sounded like yes, without saying yes. His father opened the back door and leaned into the frame as if listening to the neighborhood think. Emma asked if the engines would be louder than the freight, louder in a different way. Daniel said, "Trains are long loud, bikes are short loud." He slipped the earplug case into his pocket, not deciding yet whether he would use it. Tools can ride along until needed. They ate and cleaned and gathered what tomorrow would ask for. A bottle of water, the laminated map, the small notebook, a pen that wakes on the first stroke. His mother slid the email and the map back into the binder and closed the rings. She put the binder into a canvas bag and hung it on the chair by the door. She touched the handle the way a person touches luggage before a trip, a small check that the world still holds. Night pressed its palms to the windows early, as November likes to do. Lamps turned on and made quiet islands on tables and floors. Daniel went to his room and set the earplug case by his watch. He wrote in his notebook the words "cleared to return" and the time of the second call in words. He wrote the presence of the laminated map. He wrote that the pastor's voice sounded like warm wood. He wrote that the chief drew a square for me. He copied the header line sent at 7:12 in the morning and underlined it once, because timestamps keep days from erasing themselves. When he turned out the light, he did not count minutes or rails. He listened, far away, and then not as far. Engines practiced being quiet. He could hear it the way he hears the middle whistle, a promise that arrives before it is visible. The clock in his head clicked once in approval. The rules were set. The papers were signed. The arrows had direction. He closed his eyes and saw the small square that would be his, and the clean line from that square to the edge, and the open air beyond, if he needed it. On the refrigerator, the printed email rested beneath a red barn magnet. The header glowed faintly when the hallway nightlight came on. Sent at 7:12 in the morning. It repeated without speaking. Route and idle protocol. It said again. His mother's initials sat beside the chief's note. Ink and plastic and signature held the day steady. Outside, the town practiced being calm. Inside, the house practiced being ready. Morning lifted slow and pale over Millbrook. Light thinning through bare branches, the air cold enough to pinch a nose and clear a head. Daniel woke before his alarm and lay still for a few breaths, listening for the house. The house answered with the small order he trusted. A kettle beginning and stopping, the scrape of a chair leg, the whisper of paper turned by a careful hand. He sat up, slipped the soft case with the earplugs into his pocket, and touched his watch face with one fingertip, as if greeting a steady friend. In the kitchen, the canvas bag waited on a chair by the door like luggage before a trip. The binder sat inside, its clear sleeve catching a square of window light and flashing mutedly. His mother spooned oatmeal into bowls and set them down with a rhythm that did not hurry. His father stood by the back door, with both hands around a mug, as if the cup might hold a private weather report. Emma came in, wrapped in a sweatshirt, 2 sizes too big, and pressed her cheek to Daniel's shoulder before reaching for sugar. "Eat," his mother said, which meant we are going to be all right. After breakfast, they checked the list again, not because they believed it had changed, but because looking keeps a day from slipping. Binder, laminated map, water bottle, small notebook, a pen that starts without being shaken, earplugs, jacket. The last thing his mother added was not on the paper. Her palm rested against his chest for 1 second, and then let go. Outside, November sat on the town like a cool hand. They drove the short distance to the church, with a window cracked for air. Main Street was awake in the way small streets wake when they are about to carry more than usual. On porches, people paused with mugs. In shop windows, yellow light made morning look warmer than it felt. Far away, a low sound gathered and spread across roofs and down into seams between buildings, a hum like weather on the move but steadier, layered. "Intentional, that will be them," his father said, not loud yet, practicing quiet. They turned into the church lot and parked where the chief had chalked a mark the day before. The asphalt was clean and dry, the painted lines freshly bright. Volunteers in yellow vests waited by cones, hand radios on their shoulders, sending out neat bursts of clipped talk. Reverend Wilson stood near the doors with a clipboard, her scarf a band of warm color against the gray, her smile the kind that did more than welcome. Daniel liked the set of her shoulders, straight and sure without stiffness. "Good morning," she said, her voice holding the wood-grain warmth he remembered from the call. "Your spot is ready. We kept it exactly as you asked." The chief arrived with a short train of patrol cars and stopped at the entrance to the lot. He stepped out, hat under his arm, map already out of a folder. Even though everyone knew the lines by heart, he spoke into his radio. The answer came back once and crisp. He circled a finger in the air and the volunteers nodded like birds at a fountain. Then he crossed to Daniel and crouched enough to set their eyes level. "Remember your square," he said. "It belongs to you. If at any moment you want air, you lift your hand and point, and we make a path." Daniel nodded and touched the edge of the laminated map through the canvas. The plastic cool through fabric. He could feel the small square on the plan, as if it were under his shoe already. A boundary he owned. The sound on the ridge thickened. Engines, many engines, rolled down through the trees in slow formation. It was not show-off thunder like summer nights, when a few riders chased their own echoes along the highway. This was a different hum, tuned low. A choir held on one vowel. Within it he could hear layers, the slightly offbeat throb of a twin beside the smoother rhythm of a touring bike, the way metal sings when it is kept to its best behavior. The hum climbed the last rise and resolved into sight. They came in a long curve, line after line, chrome and paint muted by restraint, instead of polished to glare. Leather carried patches that made a moving field of color and shape. Helmets shone like small domes. Headlights stitched a thread of white beads. The front pair signaled with hands rather than horns, and the line followed those hands as if the fingers wrote sentences no one wanted to misread. 2 patrol cars led. As promised, one ran the tail, light steady but silent. Engines turned the corner into the lot and fell into lanes, front wheels touching the stop line in the same calm beat. The first row cut its motors, and the second row did the same, and a wave of quiet moved across the lot, like a ripple smoothing a lake. Each click of a kill switch wrote a piece of silence, the hum compressed into a soft residue of heat, and the little ticks that engines make when metal relaxes. A woman rider near the front adjusted the strap of her helmet and then caught herself before the buckle snapped, as if even that small sound might violate the agreement. In the near lane, a bike eased forward, with a sidecar bolted on, and the whole lot seemed to tilt toward it. In the sidecar sat the man from the tracks, his leg in a cast from hip to ankle, the white of the plaster startling against the worn leather. He braced with one hand and raised the other in a small, careful greeting. His eyes found Daniel the way a magnet finds a nail. Upright he looked bigger, but also softer along the edges. In the saddle beside him rode the man whose voice Daniel knew from the phone, the steady one who used consent like a ritual. He lifted his chin once, not a nod so much as a statement, the language of someone acknowledging another person's space. Chief Peterson spoke into the radio. Codes Daniel could not translate and did not need to. The bike with the sidecar rolled to a marked place near Daniel's square and stopped. The man in the sidecar tightened his jaw and then let the pain out with a slow breath. He waited for help rather than fighting to climb alone, which Daniel liked. Reverend Wilson took 2 steps forward. The chief lifted a hand, and officers rearranged until the route looked like the map. Volunteers made small fences out of bodies and patients. The media pen at the edge held cameras and tripods, and the electric nervousness that glass brings. A woman raised her voice to ask if she could approach. The nearest volunteer lifted a sign that said, "Do not film the child," and smiled without showing teeth. Officers along the edges watched the cameras, watched them, and it made a narrow, polite standoff that took the heat out of the lenses. The woman lowered her voice and her camera both. Daniel stood in his square and measured his breath. The sound felt like a blanket warmed before being placed around him. He did not reach for the earplug case. It comforted him just to know it was there. His mother took his hand for a heartbeat and then let it go so he could decide about his fingers for himself. His father stood on the other side, weight set in that easy stance he used when he meant to be a wall without looking like one. Emma leaned forward until her toes left the ground and then settled back again. The man from the sidecar rose with help, balanced on crutches, and made his way toward them in careful steps. Up close, his jacket was a map of patches, a winged skull, a ring of letters, a small rectangle with a nickname stitched in thread the color of rust. A long scrape had scarred one shoulder. A newer mark overlaid on old wear. Grease clung faintly to seams. He stopped within comfortable speaking distance at the far edge of Daniel's square and did not cross it. "Morning," he said, his voice gentled by pain and by sleep, but keeping the gravel of someone who lives outside. The cast made him seem less dangerous, or maybe the care with which he moved did. "Thank you for seeing us." Daniel nodded. He looked at the cast first because it is honest to look at the truth of a person. "Is it broken?" he asked. "It is," the man said. "It will mend. Everything else already has." His gaze fell to the map corner, peeking from the canvas bag, and then to the faint chalk of the small square beneath Daniel's shoes. He made his eyes soft in a way that meant, "I see what you need, and I will not step on it." The other rider, the man from the phone, took one step forward with hands easy and empty. He offered his name softly, like a thing that should be asked for room before it occupies it. He repeated the words he had used over the speaker, now with air instead of wire between them. "We are here to honor. We are here to be guests. We will follow the rules and the route. We will leave a place cleaner than we found it. If you say stop, we stop. If you say enough, we go." Sarah inclined her head in the measured way she had when she agreed. Her voice was quiet without hiding. "Thank you for keeping your word," she said. "The plan stands. The rules stand. We are here until this boy says he is done." The chief lifted his radio again. Names came back out of the small speaker, each officer making a little oath of position. A volunteer handed Daniel a bottle of water. The plastic crinkled, a tiny sound he could put his attention on, while the larger ones waited. He held that sound for a breath, and it steadied him. Around the edges, the town had gathered without trampling. Neighbors lined the sidewalk beyond the cones, coats sipped, hands tucked or waving once, and then remembering themselves. A few faces were familiar, a few were faces he knew only by type, the way certain noses and hairlines repeat across human maps. He thought of the class fish in its rectangle and smiled, because sometimes the mind keeps what it needs in one tank. Engines clicked as they cooled or settled into quiet idle on command. A rider near the front loosened a glove and then tucked it under an elbow and folded his hands like a man in a chapel. Reverend Wilson stepped to a small microphone near the church door and did not turn it on. She lifted a palm and lowered it. Talking shrank. Inside him, the hum loosened into readiness. He took one careful step forward within his square, and the man with the cast did not flinch. The leather held another patch that pulled his attention, a stitched rectangle that read "Razor" in plain block letters. He liked the honesty of a nickname that did not pretend to be a story. "Thank you for helping me," the man said again, "because some things deserve more than one saying. You did what most people would not do. You did it fast and right. I am breathing because you are different, smart." "Different smart is still smart," Daniel said, the words arriving as if they had been waiting on his tongue. The man from the phone glanced toward a rider 2 lines back. That rider, who held something wrapped in a dark cloth, shifted as if waiting for a cue. The cue did not come yet. The man kept his eyes on Daniel and on Sarah, measuring not the crowd but the family. He inclined his head to the pastor and to the chief, and then looked to Daniel's mother again. "With your permission," he said, "we would like to say a few words and present something to Daniel. No speech longer than it needs to be. No sound larger than it needs to be. And if at any point you say end, we end." Sarah looked to Daniel. Her eyes asked the question without making it heavy. "Do you want to?" she said. "Yes," he said, because he wanted to know what lay under the cloth, and because the air felt like a signal turning from red to green. Nothing moving yet, but everything about to. The chief lifted a hand, and the lot answered by becoming even stiller. He moved one step to his left to widen the space before Daniel's square. Officers at the edges kept their attention on the cameras that kept their attention on them. The soft standoff cooling the glass. Volunteers opened a narrow aisle, just wide enough for 2 people shoulder to shoulder. The riders in the front row shifted half a foot and made a corridor with their bodies. It looked like a ritual someone had practiced without a script. Marcus, the man with the cast, balanced on one crutch and came close enough to extend a hand across the chalk line. He did not offer it for a shake. He offered it palm up, empty. The way you offer a place for a small weight to rest, the way you lift a bird without closing your fingers. Daniel placed his own hand for 1 second, felt warmth and the rough of work, then drew back. It was enough. From the second row, the rider with the wrapped object approached. The cloth fell away, and leather showed softer and lighter than the jackets around it. Edges stitched with care. Patches lay quiet on its front, like sentences waiting on a mouth. Daniel saw one emblem he had not seen before, a small figure pulling another from a line that looked like a rail. Under it, thread had written words his eyes took in but did not yet send to his mouth. He felt his fingers want to touch, and he did not move, because touching before invitation can be a kind of crossing. The man who had signed the email looked one last time at the chief, at the pastor, at Sarah. He lowered himself until his eyes were level with Daniel's. He held the vest with both hands. As a person holds an instrument, he drew a breath that did not sound like a speech, and the engines, obedient to the scene, stayed quiet long enough to hear his first word. The man who had signed the route message held the vest as if it were an instrument and not a costume. His voice reached Daniel without pushing, shaped for a room that had chosen quiet. "This is honorary," he said, "not for writing, for belonging, given with respect, under your family's rules." He looked to Daniel's mother, to the chief, to the pastor, and then back to Daniel, asking for permission with his eyes a second time. Daniel liked that. Permission felt like a lock clicking true. "May I explain the parts?" he asked. "Yes," Daniel said. The leather was soft and full grain, not shiny, not stiff. It carried a clean smell that sat between saddle and rein. The edges were bound in a narrow seam that did not bite the skin. On the left breast, a small rectangle of thread spelled a name in neat block letters. Beneath it sat a fresh emblem he had not seen before. A figure pulling another from a dark, straight line that looked like a rail. Inside the lining, a label had been stitched with careful hands. "Maida for Daniel Hayes." And beneath that, in a smaller hand, "Guardian Brother." Near the hem, a tiny loop held a paper tag, the color of wheat. The tag carried the day and the hour spelled out in words, the place named in full, and a signature that matched the one on the root message. Someone had pressed a small blue stamp into the corner, presented with the town and the pastor's initial. A receipt can live in cloth, Daniel thought, and felt the idea settle like a small weight that belonged. "We kept the weight light," the man said. "We kept the edges kind. If this feels wrong at any moment, say, stop." He stepped aside so the man with the cast could speak. The jacket creaked as the larger man set his balance. His voice came steady as gravel under a tire. "You saved my life," he said. "You did it with your brain and your heart and your hands. You told me to crawl. You pushed the bike the way an engineer would. You were not loud. You were correct. We honor that." He paused and added, "I asked for this vest. My brothers agreed. We brought it here by the book. We gave notice. We asked consent. We showed up ready to listen. That is what respect looks like." The man with the email glanced to the chief. The chief drew a thin leather folder from under his arm and set a single sheet on a small pad. He held both so Daniel and his mother could see. At the top, a title sat in plain type, "Presentation Log." Under it were lines with words beside them. Item, presented by, presented to, purpose, date, place, witness. There was a box for notes and a line for return not applicable. "We keep records," the chief said. "Not for show, for clarity. If minds blur later, paper does not. I will sign as a witness. Reverend Wilson will sign as a witness. You may initial if you want. You do not have to. Your choice." Daniel's mother breathed like a person who had put down a heavy thing without anyone noticing. She took the pen and wrote her initials beside the word received. She did not hurry. The pastor added her name in a neat hand and pressed her palm to the page as if warming the ink. The chief signed last and dated in full words. He did not write a number. He spoke each part as he wrote, as if reading out a vow. "May I hold it?" Daniel asked. "Please," the man said. The leather settled into Daniel's hands with a small, honest weight. The lining was cool against his palm. The patches lay quiet and sure. He traced the rail emblem with one fingertip and felt the slight ridge where thread crossed thread. His throat tightened and then widened. He let the widening stay. Tight did not help. "Can I wear it?" he said. "If you say yes," the man said. "If your mother says yes." His mother's yes arrived in the way her shoulders lowered the smallest amount and her eyes softened. She spoke no speech. She checked the collar seam with the practiced care of a person who trusts craft and still verifies. The man with the cast took a careful step, honoring the chalk square, and lifted the vest, the way a tailor lifts a garment for a first fitting. "May I help?" he asked. The offer waited, gentle and still. Daniel slid one arm through, and then the other. The leather lay across his shoulders and warmed at once. The fit felt exact. The edges did not scratch. His mother eased the collar so it did not fold wrong. His father smoothed the hem with 2 fingers and then stepped back. The man with the email bent a little, brought his eyes level with Daniel's, and fastened 2 small snaps. The snaps clicked with the sound of discipline. Then he stepped away and lifted his open hands, meaning this belongs to you now. Around them the riders did not cheer. They did something better. A slow clap began at one edge and rolled like a tide. Not loud, not fast. A rhythm a body can breathe to. The sound was soft skin on leather glove, open palm to open palm, people choosing to be measured, no whistles, no shout. The discipline itself was the song. Daniel stood without fidget and let the sound pass through him. The vest grew warmer. The collar settled like it had found home. He raised his hand to the rail patch, and then lowered it, and then raised it again. The emblem did not change under his touch. That steadiness felt like proof. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out clear and held. "You earned this." The man with the cast said, "We are honored to know you." The man with the email said, his eyes were clear and a little wet, and he did not wipe them. Reverend Wilson stepped forward by 1 pace. She did not turn on the small microphone. She used her voice the way one sets a hand on a railing. "This is a good thing," she said. Courage met gratitude, and they shook hands. "That is all. That is enough." The clapping folded itself down to stillness. Engines held their quiet. Somewhere a bird decided the noise had become a tree and landed. A rider in the second row lifted a small camera and looked toward the volunteer with the sign, and lowered the camera again without being told. The volunteer smiled with the eyes. The officer at the corner gave a single, slow nod. A system held. The chief lifted the presentation log and held it toward Daniel so he could see the words. "Would you like this kept with your papers or with ours?" he asked. "Either way it will be safe." "Ours," Daniel's mother said, and Daniel nodded. The chief slid the sheet into a clear sleeve from his folder and passed it to her. She placed it into the canvas bag with the binder and closed the zipper halfway, the way she always did. A small open mouth like paper prefers to breathe. "May I add one more thing?" the man with the email asked. He lifted a small envelope and a felt pen. Inside lay a wheat-colored card with a line that read, "Witnessed by." He did not offer the pen toward the crowd. He offered it to the chief, to the pastor, to Daniel's mother, and waited. "I will sign that," the chief said. He did. The pastor signed next. Daniel's mother signed last. The man pressed the flap and took a small red sticker from his pocket. The sticker carried a tiny number in letters, and the words sealed in a circle. He set the sticker across the flap and handed the envelope to Daniel's mother. A seal is not magic, Daniel thought. It is a promise in glue. The man with the cast shifted his crutch and leaned a little closer without crossing the chalk line. "I told my sister," he said. "She cried the kind of tears that heal. She asked me to say this to you." Different Smart raised her boy. "You helped him too." Without meeting him, he smiled small and true. "Thank you for that." Daniel could not hold the whole sentence at once, so he held the parts he could carry. "Sister, boy, Different Smart." He nodded once. "Slow. Do we say anything now?" Emma whispered. "We say what is true." Their mother said. Daniel looked at the man with the cast. His words found their right size. "We are friends," he said. "Friends. Visit friends." "We do," the man said. The front row shifted a half step, and the corridor opened a little wider. The man with the email looked to the chief. The chief lifted 2 fingers. Officers did not move much. The town did not surge. The media pen held its rope. "We would like," the man said, "if you agree, to welcome you, the way we welcome our own. It is short. It is quiet. It ends the moment you wish." Daniel touched the vest again. He felt the snaps and the seam. He looked to his mother. She looked to him. His father's hand hovered near his back without touching. He breathed in and out, and in again. "Yes," he said. The man raised his hands just enough for the first rows to see, and spoke without amplification, voice firm and modest. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "we acknowledge Daniel Hayes. He acted with courage and clarity. He acted without noise and with correctness. He protected life where life was in danger. He honored values we claim. We present colors to him as family under his rules, under the witness of his town, under the care of his mother and father. We pledge regard. We pledge discipline. We pledge protection that asks first." He did not try to hold the last word. He let the quiet answer, and the quiet said what speeches try to say. A rider in the third row began the slow clap again. One beat on the beat. A human body keeps when it walks. The tide of sound came and went once. Daniel stood in it and felt his chest loosen. The vest had warmed fully now, as if the leather had decided he was a place it could stay. "Turn once," the man said gently, "only if you want. Let people see." Daniel turned in his chalk square. He did not hurry. He faced one row, then the next. Eyes met his, and then dropped, and then returned. The way people look when they want to be respectful and still see. He saw helmets and beards and a silver hoop and a painted nail and a scar on a jaw and a linesman's hands folded quiet, and a pastor's hand on a clipboard and a chief's pen tucked behind an ear and his mother's open palm at her side. He saw a camera lower. He saw a neighbor use a sleeve on a face and then blame the air. He saw Emma stand taller by a little. He stopped turning where he had begun. He touched the rail patch one more time. The thread held steady. He liked that. "Thank you," he said again. His voice made a shelf strong enough to hold the moment. "We are here." The man with the cast said, whenever asked, "Not a breath longer than welcome. Not a breath shorter than needed." The pastor touched the switch on the small microphone, and it woke with a soft breath. "Inside," she said, "there is coffee and water and a quiet room, if quiet is needed. If the family would like, we will ask blessing. If not, we will offer chairs and doorways, and the warmth of many hearts held still." Her eyes moved to Daniel's mother. Her hands stayed at her sides. "We will go inside." Daniel's mother said, "Short," she added, "quiet." The man with the email nodded and looked to the chief. The chief spoke 2 soft words to his radio. The corridor widened without the crowd losing shape. "Engines stayed dark," Leather whispered. "Boots found line." The rope at the media pen stayed a rope. Volunteers made small doors out of their bodies and patience. Daniel adjusted the vest with 2 fingers and checked the pocket for nothing, and liked that it was empty. An empty pocket can be filled with what matters, he thought. Receipts, he thought, and the word did not feel like paper. It felt like care. He glanced at the canvas bag where the presentation log now rested. The zipper showed a wedge of clear sleeve. He pictured the binder rings and the barn magnet and the small blue stamp and the red seal, and his mother's careful initials. Order can be a form of love, he thought. He took a step toward the church doors. The vest settled with him. The quiet held. He breathed leather and cool air, and the faint sugar of a pocketed mint. He heard the tiny click of the pastor's pen and the soft tick of cooling metal, the kind of tick a good machine makes when it rests well. He walked through the corridor the riders made, his chalk square behind him, the rail patch at his chest, the simple weight of belonging on his shoulders. Inside waited lightened chairs and a room that could hold words without letting them grow too loud. He did not yet know what he would say, only that the vest had spoken first without lifting its voice. He liked that. He liked order that felt like kindness. He liked ritual that did not swallow the person inside it. He liked that a crowd could learn to breathe together when asked. He reached the threshold, touched the rail patch once more, felt the thread answer with its small, sure ridge, and stepped in. The vestibule smelled of lemon oil and old paper, a quiet that steadied the chest from the inside. Daniel felt the shift, the way he felt the middle note of a train whistle when a door closes behind many people and the air becomes softer. Light slipped through high windows in long, pale rectangles and settled on pew backs rubbed smooth by years of hand. Leather-brushed wood, boots learned their manners. Voices, when they rose, arrived careful and low, as if the room had asked to be carried instead of pushed. Reverend Wilson waited at the aisle with her clipboard turned into something gentler by the way she held it. She looked at Daniel's mother, then at Daniel, and tipped her head as if to say that his pace would be the room's pace. Chairs stood near the front, not on the dais but close enough to be seen. A small table held a glass pitcher, paper cups, and a box of tissues with blue leaves, printed like a quiet field. Someone had set a card by the water with a single word written in round letters. The word was welcome. The riders entered like tide finding shore, filling pews without pressing. Jackets eased, gloved hands folded. A child near the rear tried to cough without being loud, and a peppermint answered the try with a soft rustle. Even rappers learned to be careful. That pleased Daniel. Carefulness was a shape he trusted. By the side aisle, a camera stood on a short tripod. Lens cap on, red tally dark. Beside it, a woman in a plain sweater held a simple form on a clipboard. She spoke to Daniel's mother in a voice like cloth laid flat on a table. "We only record if you consent," she said. "One camera, one file. For your family and for the church archive. No broadcast. If you prefer new record, we keep the cap on and it stays on." Daniel's mother read the paper line by line, lips shaping words the way she did when she wanted to be exact. She signed slowly. The woman signed, then dated in full words, and pressed a small round stamp that said Church Archive into the corner. She slid an empty paper envelope onto the table and wrote the day on the flap. A record grows legs when it gets a name, Daniel thought, and the thought made his shoulders sit easier. Reverend Wilson stepped to the small lectern and let the room breathe with her for a moment before she touched the microphone. She met the eyes of the chief, the eyes of the man who had written the email, the eyes of the man in the cast, and then the eyes of Daniel's mother. She lifted her chin. Warmth filled the space without sighs. "We gather in thanks," she said. "We gather in respect. We gather to honor an act that was precise and brave." She looked at Daniel, not past him and not above him. "Daniel," she said, "would you stand with me here?" "Only if you wish." He walked the last few steps in his vest that had already decided he was home. The snaps sat where they should. The seam did not scratch. He set one hand on the edge of the lectern and felt the grain under the varnish, a shallow wave of tree still living under the finish. Wood remembers even when it is furniture. He liked that. "Would you tell us," the pastor asked, "what you were thinking when you saw the danger?" Daniel kept his words small enough to hold. "Trains are heavy," he said. "Trains do not stop fast. A man was on the rail, so I helped." "Were you afraid?" she asked. "A little," he said. "Being afraid does not mean you stop. Being afraid means you move careful." The quiet changed shape as people took that in. It did not break. "What did you know that helped you act?" she said. "I know patterns," he said. "I know the distance from whistle to bridge. I know the time between notes. I know wet metal talks different." The bike was heavy from the wrong side. Pushing works when lifting does not. Crawling is faster than thinking about crawling. Near the side aisle, the red tally blinked once and held steady. The lens cap stayed on. Power flowed. Evidence existed without turning into glare. Daniel saw this without turning his head and liked it. From the pew, the man in the cast rose one notch on his crutch and spoke without taking space that had not been offered. I doubted him for one breath, he said. I was wrong. He ordered me to crawl like a sergeant who knows the field. He did the physics and saved my life. I am asking forgiveness for that doubt. I am giving thanks for being corrected. You are forgiven, the pastor said with the plainness of water. Thank you for saying it out loud, Daniel added, because truth spoken is a good truth. The man who had written the email kept his hands clasped on his lap and did not stand. He did not make himself a center the room had not chosen. When he spoke, he faced the pastor and then the family. He taught us the shape of our values, he said. Not with a lesson. With action, we are learning still. Reverend Wilson nodded once and turned again to Daniel. Would you like to add anything? She asked. Only what you wish. Daniel felt the vest against his shoulders, warm now like a thing with a heartbeat. He rested his fingers on the edge seam and let the seam answer. His words lined up like cars on a clean track. People think I am not smart, he said. I am smart in a different way. Different smart is still smart. I know trains, I know patterns, I know when to help. He looked at his mother. She looked at him. That was enough. The pastor set her palm over the glass pitcher, as if blessing water with steadiness. She looked to the chief. Would you read what is on your paper? She asked. The chief stood without theater. He held the presentation log like a birth record, or a title, or a report that must be true. Item, he read, honorary vest, presented by writers, presented to Daniel Hayes. Purpose, to acknowledge courage, clarity, and correct action in a life-saving event. Date in full word. Place in full words. Witness, this church, this town, this family. Notes, respect under rules. End of log. He did not add a single word. He slid the sheet back into its clear sleeve. The quiet slide sounded like a thing returning to its right container. A hymn book opened and then closed without a page turned. The pastor smiled at that small habit and let it be. Let us give thanks in a way that fits today, she said. No grand speech, just a moment with our feet on the floor, our hands resting, our eyes open or closed as each prefers. The room settled into a quiet larger than silence, a quiet made of the same slow breath held together. Leather softened, wood held, the red tally stayed steady and kind. Daniel felt his own breath match the room, and liked being part of a thing without losing himself in it. After a span that felt exact, though he did not count it, the pastor lifted her head. Amen, she said, which meant we agree. She turned to Daniel. One more thought. If you wish, only one. Daniel nodded. Help people, he said. Ask first, then help. A rider near the aisle turned a cough into a small laugh that did not crack the room. The pastor smiled, and the laugh perched like a little bird and went still again. We will end here, she said. There is coffee and water in the hall. There are chairs and doorways and air. Those who wish to greet may greet. Those who need quiet may find it. No one took the room away from the boy who had brought them there. The riders stood in lines, not all at once. They did not pour. They flowed as if maps lived in their feet. A rope stayed a rope near the back, and cameras stayed behind it. The church camera's cap stayed on. The red tally blinked once and went dark. The woman in the plain sweater wrote on the envelope, slid a small memory card inside, and sealed the flap with a sticker that said, Archived. She handed it to the pastor, who handed it to Daniel's mother, who placed it in the canvas bag. Chain of custody. Church version, Daniel thought, and his shoulders settled like a level fine center. Neighbors moved forward and spoke like people in a library who have found a book worth borrowing. That was brave and correct, said the man from the hardware store. Thank you for visiting. Daniel said, please have water. A classmate hovered near the end of a pew, fingers in the hem of a sweatshirt. "I was mean sometimes," the classmate said. "I am sorry." Daniel looked at him and chose a sentence he could carry. "Now you know more," he said. "You can be kind now." "I can," the classmate said, and his face changed in a way Daniel liked. The man in the cast worked along the side aisle, never asking for space he had not been given. He stopped at the edge of air that belonged to the vest. "You spoke clear," he said. "You listened clear," Daniel said. They smiled with mouths and eyes, short and true. The man who had written the email stepped close enough to be heard, and far enough to leave the ritual intact. He spoke to Daniel's mother. "We will take our leave when you are ready," he said. "Outside there is coffee, as promised, and space to stand without crowding. No engines before the chief's signal, no speeches." "Thank you," she said, and relief rode inside the words like light inside glass. The pastor touched the sleeve seam on Daniel's vest, only the pad of her finger. "You did not fill this room with noise," she said. "You filled it with meaning. Thank you for letting us hear you. Thank you for keeping it small," he said. "Small can carry weight," she answered, laughing once under her breath. They moved toward the doors as a group, not a procession, more like a family leaving a meal, where everything that mattered had been said and nothing needed polishing. In the vestibule, the lemon lifted stronger for a moment, and then thinned. The outer doors opened. Light stepped in and made ordinary things bright. Outside, tables waited along the side of the church with cups and simple food. Steam rose from urns. People made lines without being told. The chief stood near a corner and spoke into his radio with words that were only words, not kindness disguised as orders. The man who had written the email checked the distance to the bikes with his eyes and kept his hands folded. Daniel touched the rail patch as he crossed the threshold. The thread answered with its small, sure ridge. "Messages can live in stitches," he thought. Cold met his face. The vest held warmth close, without trapping it. Across the lot, the machines rested like trained animals, metal ticking into comfort. Their mirrors held a slice of pale sky. A neighbor handed him a paper cup. Water, not coffee. He drank and felt the clean shape of it travel down. Good things can be simple, he thought. Emma bumped his arm with her shoulder and pointed with her chin. The news camera behind the rope stayed behind the rope. The operator lifted empty hands and lowered them again. The red tally stayed dark. A promise kept is a small light anyway, Daniel thought. Voices wove across the lot in low threads. "Please, thank you. Good to meet you. Ride safe. Be well." They hung like flags without wind. Daniel breathed. The vest felt like a sentence he could wear. The corridor he had walked inside now seemed to stay around him in open air, not as walls, but as care. He did not know what the afternoon would bring. He knew the next right thing. He would greet, he would drink water, he would listen to engines, stay quiet. He would wait for the map to speak again. He lifted his hand to the man in the cast. The man lifted his back. The day moved forward, patient and precise. Cold air sat clean on the skin and made breath show itself. Along the brick wall, tables held paper cups, a glass pitcher, and plates of simple food. Steam rose in pale threads. The riders formed lines without being told. Voices laid a low weave across the lot. "Please, thank you, ride safe, be well." The words hung like small flags that did not need wind. Daniel liked the way the space kept its shape. The rope at the media corner stayed a rope. Officers watched without leaning on power. Volunteers held signs like lanterns, steady and not in a face. The bikes waited like resting animals, metal ticking itself calm. He and Emma moved along the first table. A neighbor poured water with the patience of someone counting without numbers. The paper cup felt dry and light. Water tasted like a square corner done right. The man from the hardware store lifted a hand in a greeting that was more nod than wave. Brave and correct. He said, "Thank you. Thank you for visiting." Daniel said, "Please take food." A teacher from the elementary school stood near the archive table. "Your words inside were steady," she said. "Thank you for letting my students hear them later if you choose." She bent over the sign sheet, wrote her name in round letters, and accepted a small card that said archive on one side and thank you on the other. The woman in the plain sweater capped her stamp and stacked envelopes the way careful people stack building blocks. Every small action became its own proof. Daniel liked that. Tommy waited by the steps, hands wedged into the pocket of his sweatshirt, shoulders high. His shoes scuffed and stopped, like a thought trying to turn into words. When Daniel came within a few steps, Tommy found the sentence. "I was mean sometimes," he said. "I am sorry." The words were not many, and they were enough. Daniel set his cup down and kept his answer small. "Now you know more," he said. "You can be kind now." "I will try." Tommy said. "Try and keep." Daniel said. Tommy nodded and swallowed and nodded again, as if accepting a rule that was not heavy and therefore must be kept. Behind him, two boys from school stood with their arms crossed in the tight way of kids who do not know where to put their hands. One raised a hand halfway, like answering a question no one had asked. Daniel turned his face toward them and waited one breath. Waiting lets words find their feet. That was brave. The first boy said, "I did not think about trains the way you think about trains. I want to learn. We can stand on the bridge on a safe day." Daniel said, "We can count the time between whistles in words. We can watch the lights before the sound." The second boy's mouth drew into a grin he seemed to borrow from an older self. "Different smart," he said. "I like that." Daniel nodded. Liking a truth is a start, even if it is not a finish. At the far edge of the lot, a ring of riders made a soft door with their shoulders, guiding two older neighbors toward the coffee without letting the crowd close the path. The door moved when the people moved and dissolved when the people sat. Bodies can become maps if they listen. Daniel liked it. Rachel crossed the lot with a stride that matched the ground and not the rush. Her knit hat sat low. Her eyes saw before they judged. A boy walked beside her, a little younger than Daniel, with a face that carried some of the same shapes as Daniel's, and a grin that arrived in small bursts and stayed. His scarf carried stars. "This is my son," Rachel said. "Jeremy." Jeremy looked at the vest first. He studied the rail patch as if it could speak. His hand lifted, then held in the air. "You can touch it." Daniel said, "Light touch." Jeremy set a fingertip on the stitches and felt the ridge. His breath hitched like someone smelling cinnamon. "It says true," he said. Danielle smiled. Rachel turned to Sarah. "Thank you for holding the line," she said. "Consent first. Rules first. People will try to make a show out of what is not a show. Say no and keep saying no if the frame is wrong. Let him speak in rooms where the cap stays on the lens unless you lift it." "We are learning," Sarah said. "The binder helps. His square helps." "Squares help," Rachel said, a laugh warm and short. She touched the seam on Daniel's sleeve. "Your sentence is good. Say it again to people who forget. Different smart is still smart." Daniel said. It did not wear thin when repeated. Some sentences do not. Near the media rope, a reporter held a notebook at her side and did not raise her pen. She mouthed a question to a volunteer. The volunteer pointed to the sign that said, "Ask first" on one face and "Thank you" on the other. The reporter nodded and lowered the notebook farther. A little victory lived there, not a fanfare. A tick. The chief walked past with a stack of cones and a half smile under the season's cold. He lifted the top cone as if tipping a hat. "We have timed the exit," he said. staggered sets so the town keeps breathing. I will give the signal after coffee. No engines until then. It will be tidy. Thank you, Sarah said. The chief looked at Daniel. That patch is proper sharp, he said. Wear it the way you wore the moment, correctly and without noise. Daniel touched the rail patch and felt the small ridge answer. Even the chief used the language of edges and rules. He liked that. By the food table, a woman lifted her phone and then caught herself. She found a volunteer. May I take one photo of the vest from behind? She asked, so my mother can see the work. The volunteer did not answer alone. He looked to Daniel and to Sarah. Sarah looked to Daniel. The phone was a tool that can easily become a knife if held wrong. Daniel pictured the binder. He pictured the archived card. He pictured the rope and the cap on the lens. One photo, Daniel said. From the back, no faces. Send it to us too. He pointed to the sign sheet for contact. The woman framed the vest, so the rail patch and the words beneath filled the square. Her school ring edged the image, a small crest and a year that would someday matter to someone counting days. She checked the photo, nodded, wrote her number, typed, and waited until the little check signaled the message had left. A receipt flew through air. She thanked him and stepped away. Marcus stood where the low sun found his cast. He held a cup of coffee going cool and lifted it like a quiet toast. He did not speak until Daniel and Emma joined him, and even then he kept it small. I was wrong for a breath, he said. I will spend many breaths learning from that. Learning is slow. Daniel said, that is fine. Marcus tapped his chest with 2 fingers near the stitched name. That rail, he said, meaning the emblem. I carry it in my head now. Carry it safe, Daniel said. Rachel touched Marcus's arm just above the cast. The look she gave him held history and warning and love. He nodded back. He did not make her repeat lessons she had had to shout in other rooms to people who did not listen. A folded map lay under a smooth paperweight, like a small river stone. The route was highlighted in a gentle arc with notes that said, idle here, and hold for gap, and police at cross. A rider stood by the map with a pencil tucked behind his ear. He was explaining the stagger to a local delivery driver, using his finger like a clock hand. We run in rows of 3, he said. 2, at the narrow cross streets. If the chief wants air in the grid, no rev at the church, no horn in town. The delivery man nodded like a person recognizing another person who cares about flow. He tapped a side street. A bus sits here at odd hours, he said. The rider penciled a soft mark and wrote bus, and underlined it once. Receipts can be penciled too, Daniel thought, as long as a careful hand makes the mark. Emma returned with a plate of lemon cookies. She put one into Daniel's hand without asking, because she knew he would be too busy noticing the world to ask for himself. Butter and citrus hit his tongue. Crumbs snowed onto his sleeve. He brushed them with the side of his palm. Small messes can be solved with small movements. The rope at the media pen trembled once and calmed. A man in a worn jacket had checked his watch, lifted his phone, and then pointed at the rope, as if testing who it belonged to. A volunteer walked over at an even pace and stood shoulder to shoulder with him, not across, and spoke low. The man lowered his phone, slid both hands into his pockets, and stared at his shoes. Then he looked up. Thank you, he said, surprised by his own voice. Limits can teach manners when limits are clear. The pastor moved between groups with a small stack of folded cards that said thank you and safe travels, and showed church hours on the back. She offered, not pressed. The cards flowed like water poured at a steady pace. A sudden, soft buzzing moved like a breeze through pockets and hands. Phones woke, heads dipped. The sound was not one sound, but many little ones, like bees choosing to rest on many flowers. The man who had written the email glanced at his screen and put it away without his face changing. The chief looked, made a note with a blunt pencil, and slid the device back into his pocket. Rachel's expression flickered and then settled, like a hand briefly touching a hot stove and lifting away at once. "That is the world asking," Emma said at Daniel's elbow. "The world can wait," Daniel said. "It will have to," she answered. A volunteer whispered to the chief. The chief listened, shook his head, nodded once, and spoke into the radio with a voice that made words hold their shape. "Not yet," he said. "After coffee, after thank you." Marcus's phone buzzed in his jacket. He silenced it and laughed without humor. "They smell a story," he said to Rachel. "We teach them it has rules," she said. Behind the rope, the camera operator lifted empty hands and then pointed at the sky, as if asking to take a picture of clouds. The volunteer tilted his head. "Clouds do not need consent," he said. The operator took his cloud picture and looked relieved. Even cameras need something to do. Daniel stood inside his square made of air and faces and patience. He watched a rider kneel to tie a child's loose lace. He watched a neighbor pour coffee for a man whose hands shook and did not make a big thing of it. He watched the line flow and thin and fill and thin. The vest stayed warm. The patch stayed sure. The empty pocket waited for what mattered. Help people, he thought. Ask first, then help. Another gentle wave of buzzing moved through the lot, not loud and not in step, like distant thunder that refuses to be a storm. Messages stacked themselves quietly on screen, requests lined up with little tails of blue and green. The rope did not move. The map did not change. The rules did not soften. The chief looked at the church doors, then at the bikes, then at the family. He lifted 2 fingers and lowered them. Almost, his eyes said. Phones kept buzzing, patient and insistent. The day kept its line. The chief lifted 2 fingers, and the low talk along the lot found its last sentence and rested. A volunteer rolled a folding table from the church hall and set it beside Daniel's square. The legs wobbled, then found level on the 3rd try. A clean cloth went over it, the color of paper before ink. That pleased him. Blank is a promise. On the cloth, the woman in the plain sweater placed the canvas family bag, and the church envelope marked archived. Beside them she set a small speaker, a black rectangle, with a single bright button. A clipboard waited with a form and a pen. The pastor carried the presentation log inside a clear sleeve, and another sleeve with a single printed page. The chief brought a flat plastic pouch, with a red tamper strip, folded like a quiet tongue. He put it down the way a person who respects weight puts down a tool. The rope at the media corner stayed a rope. The camera stood behind it, with its lens cap on, the red light dark. The operator watched with empty hands. The reporter kept her notebook low, and her pen capped. After coffee, after thank you, the chief had said. The day obeyed. "We will do 3 items. The chief said, voice even, a radio recording, an email header, a photograph's time mark, then sealing. Then we go in peace." Daniel stepped closer, right to the edge of his square. The vest settled on his shoulders as if it also wanted to watch. Emma came to his side. His mother stood to his left, with her palm flat on the binder, as if it were a warm animal learning its name. The woman in the plain sweater opened the family bag and took out the church envelope. She checked the flap and the small sticker that said archived, and nodded once to herself. She slid a memory card into her palm, a dark seed that now carried a morning. She held it up so the lot and the air could see the something that would soon become proof. She set the card down, laid a cable beside it, then looked to Sarah. "You consent to playback of the radio log only," she said. "No images. The card returns to you after 1 file. 1 Use. 1 seal. Yes, Sarah said. Her voice did not tremble. Consent first. The woman pushed the card into a tiny reader with a click. Daniel liked. The click sounded like a bead falling into a jar to tally something worth counting. She pressed the bright button. The speaker woke with a small hello and then behaved. Static came first, like snow without cold. Then a voice through the grit, clipped but careful. Millbrook Dispatch. A caller reporting a man injured. Possible entrapment on the 3rd track near the marker east of town. The voice said. The words arrived measured, as if they had trained themselves to carry truth and not spill. Another voice came a breath behind. Engine 1 copies. En route. Time marked. The second voice answered. Somewhere small in the speaker and larger in Daniel's head, sirens rose and then fell into distance. He remembered the slope under boots, the gravel trying to slide, and then deciding to hold. The recording continued in short lines. Weather noted, access confirmed, control notified, rail clear to slow, all said by people who had learned that exactness makes saving more likely. Daniel watched riders and neighbors take it in. Bodies stilled the way bodies do when truth steps into a room with clean shoes. The chief lifted his hand, and the woman pressed the bright button again. The sound stopped 1 syllable before it could turn from proof into noise. The chief nodded. That is the call, he said. The time aligns with what witnesses reported. We mark it here. He took the clipboard and wrote the hour and minute and second as words, not digits. He spoke them as he wrote, the way a person reads a vow while signing it. Words into ink, ink into record. He handed the pen to the pastor. She signed and read her name as if each letter was a person in a small town that deserved to be seen. Sarah signed. The woman stamped Church Archive in soft red. The paper accepted the mark the way skin learns a new ring. Item 2, the chief said. The pastor slid open the second sleeve and lifted the printed page with the careful thumb and forefinger of someone moving delicate fabric. The header showed lines and names and dates that looked like a trail left on purpose so others could follow without falling. From Thomas Chun to Chief Peterson. Subject, route and idle protocol. Sent at 7 and 12 in the morning. Received at 7 and 12 in the morning. Server time. Smaller lines below spoke in the patient language of machines about passing and receipt and proof of path. Daniel did not need to understand each word to recognize a map. We read it back, the pastor said, and she did, every field in full words, the minute exact, the body left unseen. That belonged to care, not to daylight. She slid the page back into its sleeve and smoothed the seam with her palm. A lid settling, an envelope lip made sure. She handed the sleeve to Sarah, who opened the binder rings and fed the plastic in. The rings closed with a click that traveled farther than their size. Should allow. Item 3, the chief said. The volunteer who managed the single permitted photo stepped forward. He held his phone with both hands like a tiny bird that could fly if squeezed. He showed the back of the vest, the rail patch filling the square, the words stitched beneath. In a corner, the phone had written a line in its own voice. The day and the second and a set of coordinates that meant this church, and a string that named the device. The woman with the school ring had sent it as promised. A receipt through air, now proof in hand. We will fix this to paper as well, the volunteer said, already lifting a small printer that a neighbor had lent and labeled with her name on neat tape. The printer hummed like a refrigerator, thinking. A milky square came out and darkened as its chemistry made up its mind. He held it by the edge and let the cold help it finish. The chief set the square on the clipboard and spoke the day and place that the edges claimed. He wrote them behind the photo. The pastor initialed. Sarah initialed. The volunteer initialed. The paper gained 3 little spines. Now the seal, the chief said. The woman in the plain sweater lifted a small black drive out of a clear bag. She showed it to Sarah, to the pastor, to the chief, to Daniel. She set it on the cloth for a count of 2 so the heir could say, "Here." Then she placed it inside the flat pouch and drew the red strip over the mouth. "We will speak the number," she said. "We will write it. We will press it." She read the characters printed tiny on the red strip as words. She wrote them on the form. The chief wrote them. The pastor wrote them. Sarah wrote them. Then the woman pressed the strip down. It made a faint sound like tape choosing loyalty. She tugged, and it held. If someone tore it later, it would scream with the white scars of tamper. Something inside Daniel eased the way a knot gives once and lies flat. "Where does it go?" Emma whispered. "With the church envelope," the woman said, "into family custody, until and unless shared. Name, date, place. It will live in the binder until the binder becomes a box, and the box becomes a shelf. That is a good life for a record." Sarah took the sealed pouch. The red strip rested like the tongue of a bell after the ring. She slid it into a sleeve in the binder. The metal rings closed with that honest click. A house can have a lock. A family can too. The chief turned to the lot, not to the rope. "We have done what we said we would do," he said. "We played the call. We read the header. We stamped the image. We sealed what needs sealing. There will be no more recordings. There will be no engines until departure." He looked to the writer who had written the email, then to the pastor, then to Sarah, then to Daniel last. "We are ready to end later. For now we remain as we were, respectful and precise." A rider near the edge lifted a hand and lowered it again. When a volunteer shook his head, the rules had a shape you could feel. The rope shifted and settled. The reporter mouthed, "Thank you," to the process itself. The camera operator filmed a passing cloud, not because clouds need consent, but because hands need purpose. Marcus edged forward and stopped at the line of air that belonged to the table. He kept his voice where Daniel could hear, and where the table could too. "You just watched grown people behave the way you do," he said. "It is a relief. It is correct." Daniel said. Hammer leaned close enough to share the circle, and not so close he would bend it. He looked at the pastor, then Sarah, then the chief. He kept his words under the cold and above the ground. "We will keep to the stagger and the quiet," he said. "We will stop for the bus on the side street. We will idle low. We will leave in sets. We will keep our promise." He turned to Daniel and did not reach for the vest. He let his eyes rest on the rail patch. "We will leave you with your day," he said, "but we will not leave you in your life." Daniel nodded once. Sometimes a nod is larger than a sentence. A neighbor came with 2 paper cups and a small plate, and set them on the corner, then wrote on the rim with a pen, and laughed and rubbed the ink away, and wrote for the boy instead. A town can find a joke that does not wound. The chief turned the clipboard for the last time. He wrote, "End of reveal" in plain letters, the date in full words, the time in words, the place in full word. He lifted the pen and set it down as if pens also deserve rest. The clip snapped shut, like a small, safe door closing. "I like that sound," Emma whispered. "Me too," Daniel said. He felt something else arrive, the hum of order returning, not as noise but as the memory of coordination, the map beginning to speak again. The pastor folded her hands and looked at the table the way one looks at a person. "Thank you," she said to it, which was also to them. Small rituals have good appetites. They eat fear and leave order. Sarah lifted the binder and the sealed pouch together and slid them into the canvas bag. The bag made a soft thump against her hip and found its place, as if it had always been part of her. The volunteer drew the cloth from the table, like a flag being put away, and shook crumbs into his palm and carried them to the bin with dignity. The woman in the plain sweater clicked the card from the reader and put it back in its paper jacket. She wrote the seal number on the flap and pressed the paper down with a finger kissed for luck, which here meant care. The chief raised 2 fingers and kept them lifted. "Sets of 3, he said into the radio. 10 counts between. Police at the cross streets. Hold for the bus, if present. No horns. No rev. Begin on my mark." He kept his eyes on Daniel and dropped his hand. Engines woke like animals told by a hand signal to rise. Not a roar. A collective breath. Machines that had practiced being quiet now, practiced leaving correctly. Mirrors caught sky. Leather creaked. Hands found grips. The first row rolled. The second weighted the count and rolled. The third marked the bus that was not there and rolled. The line curved like thread, pulled through fabric without tearing it. Neighbors waved. Riders answered, without breaking formation. The cups emptied. The cloth waited to be laundered and to become clean order again. The rope loosened and then was gathered and coiled like a well-kept hose. Daniel touched the rail pad. The vest felt like a sentence he could wear, and a vow that did not need loudness to be true. The sealed pouch in the bag beside his mother made a small square weight he could locate without touching. It felt like safety grown sensible. He listened to the engines fade into an orderly distance. He listened to the last click of a ring. He listened to the kind of quiet that follows proof and is better for it. The map in his head turned a page to whatever came next. The engines thinned into distance like a long breath let go, and the lot returned to the kind of quiet that lets paper be heard. Inside the church hall the air was warm and smelled of coffee and lemon and the dry dust of hymn books. A long table stood cleared of cups, holding only a stack of blank forms, a heavy little stamp, an ink pad, the shade of berries, and the binder with its calm spine. The cloth beneath everything was the color of paper before ink. Daniel liked that. Blank meant ready. He stood with the vest warming his shoulders and watched as the people who had become his careful circle settled without being told. His mother set the canvas bag on the table so the sealed pouch and sleeves could rest where eyes could find them. The pastor drew a chair and squared it to the edge. The chief sat with his radio quiet against his hip. Hammer stood because the moment fit a standing man. Marcus eased down beside Sarah so the cast would not argue. Rachel leaned at the table's end. Jeremy stood with his scarf of stars tucked inside his coat. Emma took her place on Daniel's right. He felt the whole shape of them the way he feels a map. "We keep our promise to leave the day to the town," Hammer said, voice sure and low. "But before we disperse, we ask for a few minutes to set the next right thing in motion. Not a show, a structure. A few minutes is plenty if the lines are straight," the chief said. He slid the first page forward. Across the top it read, "Meeting record in clean type." Beneath that, spaces waited for date, place, purpose, and names. He uncapped his pen with a neat click and read the first line aloud as he wrote. He always read what he wrote. It turned ink into agreement. "Purpose," the pastor said, as if speaking an answer helped the question arrive. "To create a simple and lawful way to support young people who show courage and care, with special attention to those the world underestimates." Daniel liked how those words sat. They were small enough to hold. He nodded once. A nod can be a signature when you are the one everyone is protecting. His mother looked at him. "Are you all right?" she asked, and under her question lived 1,000 hours of advocacy, and another 1,000 held back. "Ask first." He had said it. She lived it. "I am all right," he said. "We can do the paper." Rachel set her palm near the stamp and did not touch it. "Paper is the spine that keeps stories from folding under pressure," she said. but only if the people holding it remember what the story is. No inspiration circus. Consent first. And the rule we learned this morning stays the rule. He speaks for himself. He speaks for himself, Sarah said, not soft, not loud, just true. Hammer reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out an envelope with the plain, careful face of a thing that mattered. On the flap, someone had written a line in neat block letters, a name and a purpose. He set it down without sliding it, as if even friction might smooth intention. We have riders who want to help, he said, not with noise, with fuel for the work. This is a start. He looked to the chief. You will want a trail. We will accept it only with a trail, the chief said. He turned the meeting page, so the column for attachments waited by the envelope. He wrote envelope, pledged, and spoke the words as he wrote them. He drew a small square where a stamp could land when it was time, then glanced at the stamp as if asking it to wait its turn. What do we call it? The pastor asked. Names should fit like jackets. The boy should say, Marcus said, his eyes held steady and clear. Daniel touched the edge seam of his vest, then the rail patch with the stitched pull. He thought in rectangles, as he always did. He pictured a shelf. He pictured a box with a label. He pictured someone in a year, or in many years, opening that box and reading a line that told them what lived inside. Courage is the right word, he said. Not fame, not miracle, courage and care. He paused and felt the weight of the rest, and it should have my whole name, so people know who is responsible for the rules. The pastor wrote as he spoke, and gave each word its sound. The Daniel Hayes Courage Fund. She underlined fund once, careful not to cut the page. This begins as a pledge, and becomes a proper foundation. When the law asks it to, the law will ask for officers and minutes and signatures, the chief said. He looked at Sarah. We can keep today simple and clean. A record of purpose, a record of consent, a record of custody for what is offered. Consent first, Sarah said. She turned to Daniel. Do you agree to your name carrying this? She asked. You can say no. You can say later, I agree, he said. But the rules ride with it in writing. Ask first, then help. He looked to the pastor. Can that be written? He asked. Like the lines on the map, the pastor smiled. The sort of smile that knows work is holy. She wrote the line beneath the purpose and read it back. Ask first, then help. She drew a small square beside it, a place for a check. She checked it and looked at Daniel. He nodded again and felt the nod land. Rachel cleared her throat. I want one more line, she said. A simple sentence that keeps the center where it belongs. She looked at Daniel, as if asking permission to propose what would live in his house. Say it, he said. Nothing about us without us. Rachel said. That means decisions include the people affected as more than decoration. It is an old line in some fights. It fits here. Emma whispered the line to herself and liked how it fit inside her mouth. The pastor wrote it. The chief nodded. Hammer's face wore the look it gets when a sentence straightens a room. Marcus let out the breath of someone who has found the correct fix. At the rope, the reporter watched with her notebook still closed. The camera operator checked the lens cap, confirmed the darkness, and let his hands rest. Outside, bikes hummed in staggered distance like disciplined birds crossing a sky. Phones in pockets offered small bees of buzz, but the room did not bend toward them. The chief's phone murmured and he glanced down. His jaw made a small square shape. He set the device face down and did not touch it again. We have a request from a national show, he said. They ask for exclusive footage and say they will tell the story right if they can own it for a cycle. His voice made the word own sound like a chair that does not fit the person sitting. Hammer looked at Sarah, then at Daniel. He did not answer first. Marcus watched the envelope as if asking it to stay patient. Sarah picked up the phone. Read the lines with the fast stillness of a person trained by too many emails to find the harmful clause on the first pass, and set it down like a nurse sets aside a tool she will not be using. That contract asks for what we do not give, she said. No exclusivity, no control without consent, no cameras without our cap lifted by us. She touched the binder. We have our own receipts. There will be pressure, Rachel said. They will hint that saying no means the story fails. That hint is a lie. Our answer can be short and kind. The pastor said, "Thank you for your interest. Our material remains in family and community custody. Our rule is ask first, then help." Daniel listened. As the room settled into one tone, the vest felt a little heavier in a good way. His eyes went to the stamp. It waited. The chief drew a fresh page. Decision log, he read, and wrote it. He wrote decline exclusive and read it aloud. He added because consent and community, and read that too. He looked at Daniel. Say the rule, the chief said. Ask first, then help, Daniel said. The chief wrote it again under the decision and initialed. The pastor initialed. Sarah initialed. Hammer initiale. Marcus put down the letters of his given name beside the stitched road name on his jacket. As if those names were learning to be neighbors, phones buzzed together then, like bees choosing one flower. The reporter's eyes flicked, then stayed. She did not move. The camera operator studied the ceiling like a person who chooses to watch paint dry on purpose. Restraint is a learned muscle. The chief allowed himself one glance at the screen. He held the phone so all could see the new message without crowding his shoulder. The show had posted a soft accusation that refusal meant fear. The words wore a polite face and carried a push. Overreach. Rachel said, the laugh without humor, short and true. They will trip themselves if we keep our feet where we agreed to stand. We answer one sentence at a time with truth we can prove, Hammer said. Not performance, just receipts. The pastor placed the presentation log so the red archive mark faced the room. She set the sealed pouch so the red strip showed its neat characters. She touched each item as if introducing them. Call record, header, image, seal. Then she laid her hand on the new page with the fresh sentence. Decision. Because consent. The chief lifted the heavy stamp, pressed it into the berry pad, and raised it without haste. He looked at Daniel. You should press it, he said. It is your line as much as ours. Daniel wrapped his fingers around the wooden handle. The wood felt worn by other hands, and also he held the stamp above the small square the chief had drawn by the words that said received. He lowered his arm. The stamp met paper with that quiet sound of duty done, a soft thud that still travels. He lifted it and saw the words standing in clean block letters. The ink shone for a breath, and then settled into the page like a lesson finding its home. That sound might save me again, Marcus said, a laugh threading his breath. A stamp can say more than a speech. It says the door is shut to nonsense. The chief said, Where does this go? Hammer asked, tapping the envelope with one knuckle and taking his hand back so he would not smear. Into the binder today, Sarah said. Into a bank box soon. Into a ledger when we make it legal. Into work when we choose a first act that fits the purpose line. She looked at Daniel. The first act should be small and right. He chooses it. Daniel looked at Jeremy, at the scarf of stars, at the seam under his finger, at the square where the stamp had landed. In his head, he drew a short list, the way a yard lays short tracks that link larger lines. A grant for equipment so a kid can do a thing he loves safely, he said. Something that is not a show, something that makes a day better, not a headline, Rachel nodded with the dignity of a person who has waited a long time to hear that sentence from someone with colors and a square and a stamp. The pastor wrote first act exploration on a fresh page and made a tiny box to check later. The chief closed the meeting record by reading the last line as he wrote it, "Meeting adjourned," he said, and then he spoke the letters of adjourned, because letters deserve to be seen. At the rope, the reporter raised her hand like a student. "May I have the exact phrasing of the rule you placed under purpose?" she asked. "No cameras, only the words." Sarah looked at Daniel. He nodded. She spoke so the pen could catch it without hurry. "Ask first, then help." Outside, the last hums of staggered departures stitched themselves into the day. Inside the hall, the stamp rested with a small halo of red on its pad. The binder's rings clicked shut with that honest sound Daniel had come to love. He felt the sealed pouch through the canvas and knew he could find it without looking. He felt the rail patch beneath his fingers and the weight of the vest, not as burden but as appointment. Phones kept buzzing beyond the door. The push from the show would echo for a while, and then trip on its own tone. The receipts would outlast it. Paper lives longer than a shout if you keep it dry and read it aloud from time to time. Emma leaned her shoulder against his. "You stamped it," she said. "I stamped it," he said, and the words steadied the air between them. The pastor slid the pages into clear sleeves. Each sheet went in with a hush that sounded like respect. The chief placed the stamp in a drawer, like a tool at end of shift. Hammer lifted the envelope and waited. Sarah opened the binder and he set it inside. The rings closed with a click like a latch finding its home. Daniel exhaled. The day had been loud and then quiet and then precise. Now it was simple again. A square on a page, a rule beneath a purpose, a stamp in a box, a promise that would travel farther than any engine if carried the right way. Justice, he thought, does not shout, it signs, and the ink dries cold and clean. The day softened around the church and the town, the way steam loosens when the kettle has been turned down. Outside, the lot kept faint dark ovals where tires had rested in obedience. A thin trace of leather drifted near the quiet corridor, and then slipped into the clear air. Someone had lifted the rope and coiled it neatly, a small gray snake sleeping on the usher table. A volunteer tipped the last cups into a blue bin and rinsed sticky lids in a sink that sang a narrow metal song. Order makes its own quiet, and the room learned that song and kept it. Daniel stood in the doorway and felt the difference. Earlier, the sound had been a layered hum with timing and edges. Now the sound was what remains after a truth has been spoken and received. He liked this kind of quiet. It was not empty. It waited like a book closed to save a place. The vest warmed his shoulders. His fingers found the rail patch without looking. His square had been lifted from the pavement, but he could still feel it. The way a ring leaves a soft echo on a finger. He checked the vest pocket and found it empty. He liked that too. An empty pocket is a promise, a space waiting for what should ride there and nothing that should not. His mother came out with the canvas bag against her hip. The binder made a steady rectangle against the cloth. The sealed pouch rested flat inside. The red strip no longer shone. It had settled into a calm red, meant for eyes that know what red means when it asks not to be broken. In the lot, she had written a label along the binder edge and had read the words as she formed them, as if labels answer better when they are heard as they are made. His father waited by the car with keys in hand, and a posture that said the day had asked long and had been answered. He opened the rear door for Daniel and for Emma, and lifted his chin toward Marcus, with a friendship that had learned its shape quickly. Marcus answered with a two-finger salute that belonged to a man speaking to a boy who is not a boy in the ways that matter most. Hammer stood a step back with the pastor and the chief, heads close for a last short line of coordination that did not need witnesses to hold. The ride home unrolled in known pieces, the feed store with the chalkboard that once sold hay and now simply said, "Thank you." The yellow house whose porch swing always offered a second soft squeak, the little lot where a market gathers in warm months, today empty, except for the pale grid of tire shadows and a chalk star near a grate, the tracks, in themselves as ever, bright along the polished crown. Daniel lowered his window, though the air held a bite. He listened for what he calls the middle whistle, the one that always sounds as if it knows how to hold a room together. The middle whistle came from far off, straight and clean. He felt it along his skin before he heard it, the way a body can feel a cat purring from another room, if the mind is set to that frequency. He pictured the engineer hands on the controls, patient hands that teach a heavy thing to behave with manners. Home smelled like clean wood and a hint of last night onion, and the honest chill that slips in around the door. He liked the map of those smells. He set his shoes by the mat, because rules belong at threshold. Emma eased grocery roses into a jar and clipped stems with the kitchen scissors, counting under her breath because counting steadies hands. Their father placed 2 small logs in the stove, with a care that made the flame say yes on the second try. His mother set the binder on the table and stood still for a breath, as if listening for something it might need from her. Then she opened the drawer that keeps everyday tools and took out a stack of clear sleeves and a small sheet of labels and a permanent marker that speaks in a soft felt whisper. She fanned the sleeves like cards. She wrote today, place and date in full words on a label, then pressed the label to the binder front below the first one. The tape made a sound like loyalty choosing to stay. Daniel smiled because the woman in the plain sweater at the church had used that phrase, and now the room owned it too. He sat and opened his notebook. The paper felt dry and smooth rather than glassy. He likes that better for thinking. He wrote a title in the middle of the page, and not at the top because he prefers centers. First act of the fund. He spoke the words in his head the way the chief always speaks, as his pen writes. He looked at the empty pocket of his vest, and then back at the page. A grant for equipment so a kid can do a thing he loves safely. The exact sentence had arrived in the hall, as easy as breathing. Now he wrote it slow, and listened for any word that did not belong. Equipment could mean many things, and he was not afraid of many things if the words around many things stayed patient and exact. He underlined the word safe once, and then wrote safer nearby. The second word, standing like a small fence that keeps the first word from wandering. He thought of Jeremy and the star scarf, and the way the boy eyes had tracked the path of the memory card, from palm to sleeve to pouch to bag. Some people understand chain of custody with their bodies first. He thought of Tommy and the apology that had come out of the boy like a coin finally released by a tight fist. He thought of the girls who had clapped with careful palms that did not slap, but pressed and made a low sound. A person can feel in the sternum. Along the margin he wrote a short list under a simple heading that said, "Listen to them." His phone buzzed once on the table. He does not like most buzzing, but this one was the single soft signal he uses for a small set of people. He lifted the phone, read the sender, and set it nearer the binder as if the line had weight and needed a steady surface. The chief had written a brief note with no heat. The national show had posted a correction and softened its tone. The words included not apology only but adjustment. Daniel read the phrase and found it useful. He wrote the word adjustment on the notebook page and drew a small square next to it. He checked the box. His mother looked up from the sleeves. "All right," she asked. "All right," he said. Then he added, "They adjusted." The word felt like a chair leg being shimmed until it stopped rocking. Their father brought the mail from the box. A letter from the school sat on top, the kind with a small window that shows your name, as if the paper is looking for you by itself. He opened it and read again and passed it to Sarah. Daniel watched her face the way he watches light on the rail. It changed slowly, from guarded to attentive to the calm she wears when good work has been done by others, and she can agree without picking up the weight. The letter was not long. It said the school would review access routes and fire drill supports and the policy on cameras in classrooms. It thanked Daniel for teaching through action and reminded families that safety and inclusion are not favors but duties. The language did not sparkle. It was built like blocks from a box, with straight sides. He liked that. "We will bring the binder tomorrow and copy pages." His mother said, "Policies like receipts live better when they multiply." The kettle clicked itself off because it had done its one job well. Tea leaves met warm cups. Water took their color in and gave steam back. His father sliced an apple. The tip of the knife tapped the board by habit like a person thinking with a small hammer. Outside, someone walked a dog. The leash made a light chain sound against a ring. The street felt awake, but not busy. Awareness without rush. Daniel carried his cup to the window and watched the last light slip from the neighbor's swing. He remembered the second squeak and then did not try to remember it. He simply let it arrive and pass. His mind likes to keep perfect lists. Today, his mind understood that some lists can rest and still be true. On the table, his notebook waited. He turned to a new page and drew a small rectangle. It was the pocket of his vest, translated into pencil. Inside the rectangle, he wrote the words "to carry." Then, beneath that, he placed short lines. "Ask first, then help. Nothing about us without us. Receipts belong in houses and churches and pockets." He stopped and looked at that last line. It was longer than the others, but it earned its length. He kept it. From far off the tracks offered another horn, not the middle whistle. The end of day one, the one that means crews switch and rails cool and the freight finds a night posture. It was lower and patient, a little tired in a good way. He heard it as a statement. "We did our route without drama. We will do it again tomorrow." That made sense. Tomorrow almost always means again and also new if a person cares enough to notice. Emma came to the glass with a cracker for him and one for herself, because snacks are friendlier in pairs. She leaned her head on his arm and looked at nothing in particular. Sometimes looking at nothing lets the important thing come forward by itself. "Will you put something in your pocket?" she asked. "Soon," he said. "The first paper that is not a copy, the first receipt that begins a day for a kid. Maybe a picture of a tool or a helmet or a piece of equipment that someone will hold. The pocket is waiting on purpose." "You sound like the pastor," she said. "The pastor sounds like rules," he said, and smiled without showing teeth. Screens around town glowed and dimmed and glowed because people cannot help but tell each other what they saw. Videos would be cut and captions debated, and 1,000 comments would try to make a small story carry too much. That is all right. The binder has its own gravity. The stamp left its square voice in the log. The envelope waits with the patience that does not ask for praise. Receipts are not jealous. They do not care who gets the last word, as long as the right words remain. He went to his room and set the vest on the chair back with care. The leather kept the shape of his shoulders for a moment, and then let it go. He traced the seam around the rail patch. The threads lay flat and firm, the spacing exact, no loop too long or too tight. Someone had done the work with a steady hand while thinking about the person who would wear it. He thanked that unknown hand in his head And then with one soft word, "Thanks" is a receipt too. On his desk rested the small photograph the volunteer had printed. The single image allowed, the back-patched vest, centered square, and a time stamped in tiny machine letters. He slipped the photograph into a clear sleeve and wrote the day in full words on a narrow strip and tucked the strip inside. He did not add the sleeve to the binder. The binder keeps community custody. This would live on his wall, where his eyes could take it in, and then move past it to homework, and the train schedule, and the small card where he had written the word courage beside a box. He will check when the first grant moves. In the hallway, his parents spoke in the tone that belongs to little steps. After a big decision, tomorrow the bank, next week the school meeting, the pastor had offered the fellowship room for a monthly circle. The chief would send the plain phrasing he trusts for minutes. Rachel and Jeremy would come on the first Saturday they could, and the scarf with stars would hang over a chair like a flag that does not need wind to mean what it means. All of it felt like a map that does not brag about itself. He lay on his bed and let his hands rest on the quiet of his stomach. He counted a few slow breaths and then stopped, not for number but for reset. The ceiling kept tiny marks from the time Emma had thrown a rubber ball straight up and had almost succeeded. He smiled because almost is its own kind of victory when the attempt is careful. He thought about the way the show had adjusted. He did not feel like winning. He felt like a chair made level at last. He thought about the school letter. He did not feel thanked. He felt like a train that reached a station on time because the signals worked and the crew did their duty and the rail was sound. The feeling had no glitter, and that made it better. He rose and returned to the table. He tore a small slip from the back of his notebook and wrote in careful block letters 2 short words. First act. He set the slip in the vest pocket. The pocket accepted it without a wrinkle. Then he took the slip out again and slid it under the refrigerator magnet. Some words belong where other people can see them, and not only the person who carries them. He looked at his mother, and she looked back. She did not speak. She set her palm flat on the binder and lifted it, then set her palm flat on the top of his head for 1 second and lifted it. That felt like a blessing and like inventory. He laughed in a quiet way that did not need sound. Night came the way it always comes here, with a slow blue that turns to slate and then to a soft black the eye can rest in. The last train of the evening took the long curve and made its end of shift whistle. The sound came low and careful. It did not ask for attention. It marked a fact and trusted the town to understand. He closed the door and the latch slid and settled. A small click, honest and enough. Justice, he thought, does not shout. It signs in cold ink. At its heart, this story reminds us that justice isn't about noise. It's about truth that holds steady, even when no one is watching. It speaks to the quiet power of people who choose order over chaos, respect over spectacle, and integrity over fear. Daniel's journey shows that real courage isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet act of asking first, of standing your ground with kindness, of letting facts, not fury, speak for you. It's about finding peace in your own difference, understanding that different smart is still smart, and that fairness starts not in a courtroom or on a screen, but in the way we treat one another every single day. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice, this story gently reminds us that silence isn't weakness when it holds principle. It asks us to look again at our assumptions, to see the person behind the label, the truth beneath the noise, because as the old saying goes, the truth will stand when the world's on fire. Justice, at its best, doesn't shout. It signs its name and lets the ink dry cold and clean. If this story touched something in you, share your thoughts below. Have you ever faced a moment when doing the right thing meant standing quietly but firmly? Leave a comment, like this video to help others find it, and subscribe for more stories that challenge, heal, and stay with you long after the screen goes dark. May your days ahead be calm, your choices steady, and your hope, like Daniel's, quiet but unbreakable.